Story 1. The town of Hollybrook didn't celebrate Christmas. It enshrined it. From the first week of November until the last flake of January snow melted, Hollybrook existed in a perpetual state of saccharine, almost aggressive festive perfection. Every house boasted white lights strung in mathematically precise parallel lines. Every lawn held a nativity scene or a carved wooden reindeer, maintained with a zealotry that bordered on the deranged. The air itself smelled of pine, cinnamon, and a chilling, underlying scent of fear. Elias Thorne knew the fear better than anyone. It was his job to manage it. Elias was the town's postal carrier, a man whose quiet, shuffling presence was as much a fixture of Hollybrook as the flawless white lights. He was 52, perpetually damp from the snow, and possessed the weary eyes of someone who carried not just letters, but the moral ledger of an entire community. His real, secret job wasn't delivering mail, it was curating the list. The list, typed on stiff, yellowed parchment and kept locked in the lowest drawer of his battered desk at the post office, wasn't the municipal tax registry or the voter roll. It was the naughty list. The true one. The townsfolk, who prided themselves on their collective niceness, didn't understand that their obsessive adherence to holiday cheer wasn't about securing gifts. It was a centuries-old appeasement. It was a desperate, communal effort to ensure that their hidden sins remained obscured enough to avoid the attention of the keeper. The keeper, as the ancient folklore called him, was the entity behind the Santa Claus myth, or rather, the terrifying, true origin of it. He did not reward goodness. He merely punished wickedness. And the punishment was absolute, silent, and always delivered on the eve of December 24th, after midnight. Elias sat in his tiny, pine-scented office, the only light coming from a bare, flickering fluorescent tube. The wind outside howled, throwing sharp pellets of freezing sleet against the windowpane. It was December 23rd, the day of final review. He pulled the parchment from the drawer. It was surprisingly heavy, almost cold to the touch, and seemed to hum faintly with latent energy. Elias ran his finger down the meticulously kept records, noting the tiny, cursive annotations left by his predecessors, Thorne's, every one of them, stretching back to the original colonial settlement of Hollybrook in the 1700s. His current list contained only one name in the naughty column, and it was a name Elias hated seeing there: Caleb Vance. Caleb was a bright, but rebellious, 17-year-old. He was loud, he listened to punk rock, and, worst of all in Hollybrook's fragile ecosystem, he was a skeptic. He had publicly defaced the town's beloved, enormous fiberglass snowman with spray paint 2 weeks ago, substituting the snowman's carrot nose for a plastic chicken foot. It was petty vandalism, childish insolence, but in Hollybrook, it was an act of existential rebellion. The town's collective heart had seized up in fear, the perfect facade cracking. Elias had warned Caleb's mother, Martha, a woman whose eyes were perpetually widened by anxiety. "Martha," he'd said, leaning in close during his mail route, his voice a low rumble beneath the jingle of her porch chimes. "Tell Caleb to apologize, publicly, to the snowman, and to the spirit of the season. Clean it up, before the snow seals the list." Martha had only wept, whispering that Caleb had locked himself in the attic, blasting music that sounded like grinding metal. Now, Elias looked at the single name. Caleb Vance. Vandalism, public scorn, insurrection against the sacred order. Elias was a thorn, and the thorns were the town's self-appointed shepherds. They were not malicious, but pragmatic. The keeper needed a sacrifice. If the town didn't provide a clear, deserving target, the keeper's ancient, indiscriminate justice would take a random handful. Perhaps a well-meaning father, a kind elderly woman, or even a child who'd only forgotten to share a toy. A defined sacrifice saved the rest. Elias felt the bitter sting of moral rot. He loved Hollybrook's quiet normalcy, the deceptive peace. He knew what he had to do. With a deep, shuddering sigh, he marked the entry for Caleb Vance with a heavy, black, ceremonial X. The parchment pulsed, warm now, then went cold again. The list was sealed. Midnight approached. Hollybrook was silent, the silence amplified by the thick, insulating layer of fresh snow. It wasn't the silence of slumber, but the silence of a town holding its breath, a massed, terrified vigil. Elias had finished his preparations. He had locked the post office and was now walking his route one last time. He wore a heavy wool coat, but the cold felt supernatural, biting through the fabric and into his bones. He wasn't carrying letters, but a small, heavy silver bell, the bell of St. Nicholas, an artifact passed down through the Thorne family. It didn't jingle. It resonated, emitting a low, brassy hum that seemed to vibrate the very ground. He reached the center of town. The fiberglass snowman, now fully repaired and gleaming under the spotlight, stood sentinel. Elias stopped, lifted the bell, and rang it 3 times. Hum, hum, hum. The third vibration didn't fade. It lingered, deep and subsonic, traveling outward through the snow, like a call to a creature sleeping far below the earth. He waited, hidden in the shadows of the old church steeple. Nothing happened for a long time. The wind died completely, leaving the air still and heavy. Even the sound of his own breathing seemed deafening. Then, he heard it. A faint, distant sound that Elias recognized with soul-crushing certainty, the scrape of iron runners over packed snow. Not the sleigh bells of folklore, but the sound of something unimaginably large being dragged. The sound approached from the northern edge of town, where the ancient, dense pine forest began. It wasn't fast, but deliberate, relentless. Elias didn't look toward the north. He didn't dare. He knew what he would see. A shadow taller than the tallest pine, a shape that devoured the moonlight, pulled by things that were not reindeer, but massive, chitinous insects that pulsed with an icy blue light. And the man controlling them, the keeper, was an impossibility of scale, cloaked in fur and shadows, his presence a pressure that crushed all warmth. He kept his eyes fixed on Caleb Vance's house, 3 blocks down. The scraping sound stopped directly over the Vance residence. A few moments of excruciating silence passed, broken only by a single, sharp sound, the shattering of a windowpane, high up in the attic. Elias winced, imagining the fear, the realization that must have struck Caleb in that instant. Caleb, who had scorned the traditions, who had declared himself too smart for the town's small, provincial worries. Caleb, who had just realized that the town's worries were the only things keeping the cosmic darkness at bay. The loud punk music that had been leaking faintly from the attic cut out abruptly. There was a faint scream, quickly muffled, a sound so thin and fragile that Elias wondered if he had imagined it. Then, another scraping sound, the sound of the iron runners pulling away, heading back toward the northern woods. It was slower now, heavier, as if the cargo was fuller. Elias did not move until the last echo of the sound had died, and the wind had tentatively begun to whistle again. It was done. The list was balanced. Hollybrook was safe for another year. He walked toward the Vance house. The broken attic window was a dark, jagged eye in the pristine white structure. He noticed a single detail that confirmed everything. A thin, almost invisible sheet of black ice now coated the front lawn, even though the air temperature was far too low for liquid water. It was the residue of the keeper's passage. the residue of absolute cold. Elias retreated, his chest aching with a complex mix of relief and self-loathing. He had saved the town. But he had paid the price of his soul. The morning of December 24th dawned bright and impossibly cold. The people of Hollybrook woke up, checked their homes, and noticed the black ice around the Vance house. No one mentioned it. No one asked where Caleb Vance had gone, or why his mother, Martha, stood on her porch, staring blankly at the perfect fiberglass snowman, gripping a half-finished cup of cocoa that had long since frozen solid. They just knew. The list had been fulfilled. The town went about its business with an exaggerated cheerfulness. Smiles were too wide, laughter too loud. Children played in the snow with a desperate abandon, as if proving their own goodness by sheer volume. Elias returned to the post office to clean up the remnants of the ritual. The yellowed parchment, now tucked away, was pristine again. The black X next to Caleb Vance's name had vanished, replaced by a strange, spidery rune that Elias dared not look at too closely. He was interrupted by a visitor. Sarah Jennings, the town's high school history teacher and a recent arrival, only 5 years in Hollybrook, still an outsider in the town's ancient social fabric. She was the only person who had ever openly questioned the town's relentless Christmas traditions. Sarah stood in his office, her face pale, wrapped in a thick scarf. She wasn't holding a letter. She was holding a photograph. "Elias," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "I saw your light on last night. I couldn't sleep." The silence. It was terrifying. Then I heard it. The scraping. Elias swallowed, his eyes darting to the locked drawer. "It was just the snow plow, Sarah. You know how the town runs them late to keep the roads clear for Christmas Eve shoppers." "No, Elias. Plow drivers don't leave tracks like this." She thrust the photo into his hand. It was a blurry, grainy image taken from a distance. It showed the north end of town. In the foreground were the normal, narrow tracks of a snowmobile. But stretching perpendicular across the frame was something else. 2 parallel gouges, 6 feet wide and nearly a foot deep, as if 2 massive, sharpened rocks had been dragged across the pavement. And where the runners had stopped near the Vance house, the pavement looked oddly porous, covered in a hoar frost that seemed to be growing, not melting. "And then," Sarah continued, her eyes wide, "I found this." She set down a small, heavy object on his desk. It was a shard of something black and impossibly dense, almost like obsidian, but it was cold enough to make the wooden desk condensation freeze around it. It felt wrong, like frozen, compressed void. "It was in Caleb's driveway," Sarah said. "It looks like a piece of an industrial runner, but look at it. There are strange etchings. Do you recognize them?" Elias picked up the shard. It pulsed faintly, warm then cold. He recognized the etchings. They were the same spidery runes that now marked the parchment, the keeper's sigil. He knew he couldn't lie his way out of this. Sarah was too smart, too inquisitive, and now, too close to the truth. And if she exposed the truth, the keeper's covenant with the Thornes would be broken. "Sit down, Sarah," Elias said, the warmth draining from his voice. "I have something to tell you about Hollybrook. Something that isn't history. Something that's fact." He told her the story of the Thornes, the first settlers who came to Hollybrook in 1678, lured by the promise of fertile land and pristine snow. What they found instead was a valley cursed by an ancient, Arctic entity, the Keeper, a being of cold and judgment that predated the concept of mankind's sins. It wasn't interested in belief, it was interested in cosmic balance. It needed to feed, Elias explained, his voice low and raspy. It needed to enforce a severe, absolute order, or it would simply freeze the entire valley, taking everyone. The original Thorne, a man named Jedediah, made the covenant. A covenant. Sarah looked aghast. With a monster. With a judge, Elias corrected. Jedediah offered to act as its hands. He promised that the town would police itself, that the truly wicked, the ones whose deeds threatened the fragile order of man, would be identified. The keeper only cares about the absolute extremes of transgression. The town's collective niceness is a shield. It keeps the baseline average low. But once a year, the keeper demands the most deserving name. That's the list. That's my job. Sarah stared at the obsidian shard, then at the locked drawer. Caleb Vance. He defaced a snowman. That's a high school prank, Elias. It's not a cosmic transgression. In Hollybrook, it was, Elias said wearily. His crime wasn't the paint. It was the scorn, the public dismissal of the order. He dared to say the traditions were meaningless, risking the whole community. He became the biggest outlier, Sarah. He was the one name that made the list tidy. He slid the shard back to her. You have a piece of the keeper's chariot, Sarah. And you know the covenant. You are now part of the order. Sarah, horrified but intellectually captured by the dark history, didn't flee. She stayed, questioning Elias, trying to find a loophole in the Thorne's ancient, horrific duty. There must be a way to break the covenant, she insisted, pacing the small office. To expose it. If the whole world knew Hollybrook was built on annual human sacrifice to a winter god, they would shut it down. And the keeper would shut the valley down first, Elias countered. It's not God, Sarah. It's physics. It's the cold, given a terrible, judging intelligence. It's the price of the perfect Christmas. The tension in town continued to escalate. On Christmas Eve morning, Mrs. Gable, the town's beloved, gentle baker, had an unnerving public breakdown. She stood in the middle of Main Street, screaming about a pair of garden gnomes she had stolen from her neighbor 30 years ago. They were just gnomes, she wailed, clutching a half-eaten gingerbread man. But they're on the list. I know they are. He sees everything. Elias watched from the post office window. The collective panic was a poisonous gas. Now that Caleb was gone, the town's average, naughty, level had shifted. Everyone was now relatively closer to the top of the list. Their small, petty sins, the tax evasion, the cheating spouse, the unkind word never forgiven, felt suddenly enormous. That night, Elias was set to perform the final ritual, the blessing of the town center to ensure the covenant held. He went to retrieve the list, but the drawer was slightly ajar. His heart dropped. The parchment was gone. Sarah, he roared. Sarah Jennings stepped out from behind the stacks of undelivered packages, the list clutched tightly in her hands. Her face was set, determined. I won't let you do it again, Elias, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Caleb was an inconvenience, not a monster. This town is evil, and if the keeper demands a sacrifice, let it take someone who actually deserves it, the people who run this horror show. Elias stepped towards her. The list is sacred, Sarah. You don't understand the power you're holding. The list chooses, Sarah. It dictates. If you interfere, the keeper will come, and it won't be for one life. It will be for the whole community. Then let it, she said, her eyes blazing with conviction. It's time this town faced its true nature. She ran, tearing out the back door and into the blizzard that had just begun to rage. The snow was coming down in thick, blinding sheets. Elias didn't chase her immediately. He knew the bell would call the keeper regardless. His new, desperate mission was not to stop Sarah, but to find the list before the keeper arrived. If the entity found the list, its ledger, its contract, in the hands of a defiler, its wrath would be unfathomable. He grabbed the silver bell, its weight suddenly feeling like a curse. The wind rattled the windows, a predatory sound that seemed to speak a name: Krampus. The storm turned into a whiteout within minutes, the visibility dropping to zero. Elias struggled through the drifts, calling Sarah's name, the bell cold against his palm. He found her tracks near the town square, leading toward the glowing, absurdly perfect fiberglass snowman. Sarah, now completely exhausted and disoriented by the storm, had stopped near the snowman. She was trying to read the list in the weak, diffused light of the holiday decorations. As Elias reached her, she looked up, her face etched with despair. "Elias," she gasped, holding the parchment out. "I didn't destroy it. I couldn't. It felt like trying to tear frozen steel. But I know what it says. I saw the annotations. They took Mrs. Thorne in 1952 because she burned the church hymnals. They took the mayor in '88 for embezzlement. They took the whole Miller family in the 1800s for lying about their faith. They were all on the list, Sarah. They were the outliers," Elias pleaded. "Now give it back. The bell must be rung." "No," she screamed. "The only person who truly deserves this is the one who keeps the tradition alive. You, Elias. You have been condemning people for decades to save yourself." As she spoke, the storm intensified. The lights on the houses flickered, then died, plunging the town square into an oppressive, white darkness. And then, the silence. The same, terrifying, absolute cessation of sound from before. The wind stopped instantly. The snow hung suspended in the air. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was impossibly loud now, right at the edge of the square. It was here, early. The disruption of the list had summoned it prematurely. Elias shoved Sarah violently behind the snowman. "Get down. It's here. And it's angry." The keeper emerged from the swirling white void. It was not the rosy-cheeked caricature. It was a monolith of shadow and cold, a figure easily 12 feet tall, draped in thick, ancient furs that seemed to absorb all light. Its face was a nightmare. A pale, cracked mask of frozen skin stretched over a skull, dominated by two sockets that glowed with a faint, crystalline blue light. Its massive, iron-shod sleigh, pulled by the terrifying, insect-like creatures, stood beside it, motionless. The keeper did not speak. It just stood, a tangible manifestation of judgment, its head tilted toward the area where Elias and Sarah were hidden. Elias, driven by pure, primal terror for the safety of the town, did the only thing he could. He pulled the silver bell and rang it, 3 times, with all his might. Chime, chime, chime. The bell's hum hit the keeper like a physical force. The creature recoiled slightly, its blue eyes narrowing. "I have the list, keeper," Elias shouted into the freezing air. "I am the keeper of the list. The covenant holds." The list itself, the yellowed parchment, was now glowing faintly in Sarah's hand. She was holding it up, defiantly, staring at the monster. The keeper ignored Elias, its gaze fixed on Sarah, the outsider, the defiler who held the sacred ledger. It moved with unnatural speed, closing the distance in a single, icy gust. Elias lunged. He didn't think. He reacted. He tackled Sarah to the ground, pulling her away from the list, which slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered into the snow. The keeper stopped. Its attention shifted, drawn to the parchment, which had landed directly next to the base of the giant, fiberglass snowman. Then, The keeper made a sound. It was not a growl, but a sound of scraping ice and grinding stone, a voice that spoke not in words, but in absolute, ancient condemnation. The list is unbalanced. The deed is uncleansed. The keeper demands the greater sin. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. The keeper extended a massive, three-fingered hand, reaching not for Elias or Sarah, but for the snowman. Elias screamed, realizing the final, terrible truth. Caleb Vance had defaced the symbol of their covenant. The snowman was a blasphemy, a lie built over the ancient truth. It was the physical manifestation of Hollybrook's collective denial. With a horrifying crunch, the keeper's hand plunged through the fiberglass and into the earth. It pulled back, not holding a person, but something else. A small, wooden box, rotten and covered in centuries of mud. This was the original list. The ledger Jedediah Thorne had first used. The keeper opened the box. Inside was no parchment, but a single, carved wooden object. A miniature, blackened figure of a man, eyes wide in terror, the word lies burned into its chest. The keeper crushed the figure in its hand, and a wave of pure, absolute cold emanated outwards, tearing down the trees, shattering the windows of the town houses, and freezing the very air in their lungs. Elias and Sarah shielded their faces. When the wave passed, the keeper was gone. The storm was gone. The only sound was the distant, brittle crackle of the damaged power lines. But the fiberglass snowman was still standing, untouched. Elias looked at Sarah. She was shaking uncontrollably, her eyes still fixed on the place where the giant shadow had stood. "It didn't take anyone," she whispered, bewildered. "What happened? Why didn't it take us?" Elias stood up, slowly, his muscles seizing up from the cold. He looked down at the snow. The keeper hadn't taken a person. It had taken something more profound. The wooden box was still there, but the figurine was gone. The ground around the snowman was scarred by hoar frost. "It took the lie, Sarah," Elias said, his voice a broken whisper. The keeper saw that the biggest sin was not Caleb's vandalism, or Mrs. Gable's gnomes, or even my complicity. It was the town's absolute, unwavering pretense of perfection. The snowman was the idol of the lie. The covenant demanded the destruction of the worst transgression. He picked up the old, yellowed parchment, the list, and looked at the empty space where Caleb Vance's name had been. He looked at the strange, spidery rune. "But the list is still unbalanced," he concluded, his eyes distant. "The keeper will return next year. And now that the town has tasted its true nature, the sins will be darker. The cost will be higher." He took Sarah's hand, pulling her to her feet. "Come on. It's Christmas morning. We have to tell the town that the lights are working again. We have to make sure they know what they're fighting for." As they walked back through the silent, damaged town, Elias looked up at the moon. The sky was now a chilling, absolute black, the stars shining with a cold, unforgiving light. The fear that had always simmered beneath the surface of Hollybrook was now crystallized, sharp and real. Elias Thorne, the postman, the keeper of the list, knew his job had just become immeasurably harder. The keeper had warned them. The keeper demands the greater sin. And in Hollybrook, the greater sin was always waiting to bloom. The town woke up, found their lights restored, and knew that the terrible night was over. No one asked about Caleb Vance. They just started frantically cleaning, polishing, and smiling wider than before. They had seen the true face of Christmas, and they had survived. For now. Elias looked at the single, newly added line at the bottom of his modern list, now marked with the unsettlingly cold ink of the keeper's disapproval. The covenant, tested. Status. Fragile. and below it, the first name for the next year, written in his own, trembling hand, Elias Thorne. Breach of contract. Inconclusive. He locked the list away. He had a lot of mail to deliver, and a year to determine if his own name was one he could afford to leave there. It was the perfect Christmas morning in Hollybrook. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.